All right. A quorum being present, the subcommittee will come to order. I would like to now recognize myself for an opening statement. Today we meet to consider the U.S. policy towards Cuba, a communist country with a repressive regime that continues to actively restrict freedom of expression, association, and assembly, and to harass and jail Cuban citizens who seek freedom. As expected, even with the recent rise of a new president who is not named Castro, nothing has changed. Just this week, Martha Sanchez from the Ladies in White was sentenced to 4 years in prison for peacefully protesting against the regime. Miguel Diaz-Canel took office without a vote from the Cuban people. Raul Castro continues to hold considerable sway over the government decisions. And the National Assembly endorsed a new constitution in July that retains the same authoritarian political system and reinforces the Communist Party's control. Cuba maintains close relations with Russia and China, providing these actors with influence platforms to foment an anti-American agenda. Additionally, Cuba meddling in Venezuela and Nicaragua has contributed to increased repression and the mass exodus of refugees throughout the region. In June 2017, President Trump announced change in the U.S. policy towards Cuba with the issuance of the National Security Presidential Memorandum. This action rolled back key parts of the Obama administration's failed Cuban policy, tightened restrictions on U.S. tourism to the island, restricted the flow of money to the Cuban military, intelligence, and security service, and continued U.S. support for the nation's private small business sector in Cuba. The Trump administration has continued U.S. support for democracy and human rights in Cuba, and in calling for the release of political prisoners. Multiple efforts exist to support the critical work of human rights defenders on the island, communicate independent news to the Cuban people through the Office of Cuban Broadcasting, and increase internet connectivity with the State Department's Internet Task Force. And I fully support these actions. However, given the stakes of Cuban destabilization activities in the region and subsequent migration flows and increasing regional instability throughout the hemisphere, I believe it is in the U.S. national interest to work more with regional partners to curb the Cuban regime's ability to wreak havoc on its people and on the region. The U.S. should also continually update the list of 180 prohibited Cuban entities and individuals announced last year to further prevent U.S. financing to Cuban regime elements, reestablish the Cuban medical professional parole program, allowing Cuban medical professionals forced into modern-day slavery by the Cuban regime to apply for parole status in the United States, and to continue efforts to combat intelligence operation and covert activities with the Russians in the region, the Russians and Chinese. Advocate for the return of U.S. fugitives from Cuba, such as Joanne Chesimard, and address outstanding U.S. property claims. However, overshadowing all these issues are the unexplained health incidents that the State Department has assessed were targeted attacks on 26 U.S. diplomats and several Canadian government personnel serving in Havana. The Cuban regime failed in its international obligation to protect diplomats in Cuba, and for that it must be held accountable. I'm further concerned about the fact that we have yet to determine the cause or perpetrator of the attacks. The Cuban Accountability Review Board, known as the ARB, was submitted to Congress last week. It found that the department's security systems and procedures were adequate, but significant vacancies and challenges with information sharing existed in the department's response to the attacks. Similarly, the Government's Accountability Office, GAO, issued a recent report at the request of Chairman Emeritus Ross Layton and this subcommittee that found that the department's policies, procedure, process, and internal communications delayed the Cuban ARB from starting its work by 8 months. The department's leadership, whether in a confined or acting role, is responsible for the safety and security of Americans serving overseas at U.S. missions. 26 Americans are injured in the service to their countries, some of them severely. In today's hearing, I also want to examine the department's response to these attacks, its provision of care for U.S. personnel, and its plans to improve the significant management gaps that the GAO found. In conclusion, I believe the Trump administration's caution in staffing the U.S. Embassy in Havana is essential and prudent until we can determine the cause of these attacks and effectively mitigate it. While this decision clearly has an impact on embassy operations and objectives in Cuba that pales in comparisons to the risks associated with putting more Americans in harm's way unnecessarily. With that, I'm going to turn to the ranking member for his opening remarks, and I just want to make one final comment, and that we've had a busy morning, and we met with the foreign minister from Colombia, and we had 15 members in attendance to that. I'm surprised. So I want to thank everybody that was on this committee and the Foreign Affairs Committee, including the ranking member. We had a very, very productive session. This is ambitious today because we're going to have an open hearing, and then we're going to go down to the sealed chamber, the secret chamber, known as the SCIF. But in between that, we have a vote, or we have a number of votes. I don't know how many, but they're looking at military time. I think it's about 1,500, 15. So with that, I think I've rambled long enough, and I'll turn to my good friend, the ranking member.
Thank you, Chairman Cook, for holding this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Though U.S. policy towards Cuba has varied over the last few years, it is important that any policies considered take into account the fact that the Cuban government has done nothing to garner the trust of the Cuban people or the international community over the last 50 years. This administration spoke of supporting human rights in Cuba, yet their proposed cuts to democracy assistance suggest that this is just another example of an underdeveloped policy that has not fully been thought through. The Cuban people have been suffering for far too long under the Castro regime, and many risk their lives every day to fight for the basic freedoms. The United States must continue to stand with the Cuban people and urge their government to respect the rule of law, human rights, freedom of speech, assembly, and proceed with free and fair elections. The feigned transition of power that occurred in Cuba this April was nominal, and we should not be under any illusions about who really holds the seat of power in Cuba. Miguel Diaz-Canel was handpicked to succeed Raúl Castro, who retains control of both the Communist Party and the military. Raúl Castro continues to lead from the shadows, leaving no room for any meaningful reform. In addition to Cuba's sordid history of human rights abuses, the nation continues to maintain relationship with questionable state actors and support corrupt regimes such as Venezuela's Maduro and Nicaragua's Ortega. With a proven pattern of despicable and dubious behavior, we should ensure that any policy towards Cuba does not readily offer major concessions to the Cuban government. I look forward to hearing from this administration, and thank you again, Chairman, and thank you everyone for being here today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. Before I recognize you to provide your testimony, I'm going to explain the lighting system in front of you. This is not just for you, it's for me, because I'll mess it up. My staff will get mad at me. You each will have 5 minutes to present your oral statement. When you begin, the light will turn green. When you have a minute left, the light will turn yellow. When your time's expired, the light will turn red unless we lose the electricity. I ask that you conclude your testimony once the red light comes on. After our witnesses testify, members will have 5 minutes to ask questions. I urge my colleagues to stick to the 5-minute rule to ensure that all members get the opportunity. If we don't have that many members, we have a tendency to go back if people want to ask additional questions, and that's based upon what's going on. Our first witness to testify today will be Ambassador Kenneth Merton, the Acting Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs. Previously, Ambassador Merton served as the ambassador to the Republic of Croatia and Haiti. He also served as Deputy Executive Secretary to former Secretary of State Clinton and earlier to Secretary Royce. His overseas assignments have been in France, Belgium, Germany, and Haiti. In Washington, he served in the State Department's Operations Center as well as the Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs. Our second witness to testify is Ambassador Peter Bottle, Coordinator for the Health Incidents Response Task Force at the U.S. Department of State. Previously, the ambassador served as ambassador to Libya, Tunisia, and Nepal, and retired from the department in 2017. He returned from retirement in February 2018 to chair the Cuba Accountability Review Board, known as the AARB. And now, at my age, I think of AARP for some reason. And now the Health Incidents Task Force. He has had multiple overseas assignments in Iraq, Malawi, Pakistan, Nepal, Germany, India, Denmark, Bulgaria, and Guyana. In Washington, Ambassador Bottle served in the State Department's Bureau of Diplomatic Security and Administration. Our last witness to testify, I thought we had more, anyway. The Acting Director for International Affairs and Trade at the U.S. Accountability Office, GAO, Dr. Mazanek, who was responsible for a portfolio focused on international security. He also worked in the GAO's Defense Capabilities and Management Team. We are also joined by Dr. Charles Rosenvarb, the Medical Director in the Bureau of Diplomatic Services at the U.S. Department of State, as well as Mr. Todd Brown, the Assistant Director for Countermeasures in the Bureau of Diplomatic Security at the Department of State. Dr. Rosenfarb and Mr. Brown submitted written testimony and will sit on the panel to provide answers to many of the questions we hope will be asked. Ambassador Merton, you are recognized. The microphone.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Sirius, and distinguished members of the committee. Thanks for the opportunity to speak about the administration's policy towards Cuba and the attacks against our diplomats, our colleagues in Havana. I'm pleased to be here today with my colleagues from the Health Incidents Response Task Force, Bureau of Diplomatic Security, Bureau of Medical Services, and with representative of the GAO. Thanks for your concern for the safety and security of our diplomatic personnel in Havana, which is the department's top priority. I'll begin today by providing an overview of the department's work to implement President Trump's June 16, 2017 National Security Presidential Memorandum, strengthening the policy of the United States towards Cuba, and we will refer to that as the NSPM going forward, I think. I will then turn to my colleague from the Health Incidents Response Task Force, Ambassador Bodie, who will speak on the health attacks. I ask that the department's written statement be entered into the record. The NSPM emphasizes advancing human rights and democracy in Cuba, reaffirms the economic embargo and the statutory ban on tourism to Cuba, and aims to ensure U.S. engagement benefits Cuban people and strengthens the Cuban private sector. It also maintains bilateral engagement on issues critical to U.S. national security and the public health and safety of the U.S. The Department of State has worked diligently to put this policy into action. First, despite our reduced staffing, the department monitors human rights developments in Cuba and actively engages with members of Cuban civil society in Havana, in Washington, and elsewhere. We use international fora to work with regional and like-minded partners to share these concerns and coordinate our respective approaches. The department and USAID also continue to administer U.S. government-funded programs to promote democracy and support critical work of human rights defenders on the island. Despite the Cuban government's refusal to engage with us on human rights through a formal dialogue, we regularly speak out against the regime for repression and abuse and raise these concerns directly with the Cuban government. Second, on November 8th of last year, the department published its Cuba restricted list. The Departments of Commerce and Treasury made regulatory changes on that same day to generally prohibit direct financial transactions with any of the 180 entities and sub-entities on this list. These changes redirect economic activity that once supported the Cuban military towards the Cuban private sector and the Cuban people. Third, the department convened a task force to examine the technological challenges and opportunities for expanding internet access in Cuba. The Cuba Internet Task Force held its first meeting on February 7th, and follow-on subcommittee meetings are taking place to develop recommendations on 1, the role of the media and unregulated flow of information to Cuba, and 2, expanding internet access in Cuba. The task force will review these recommendations and prepare a final report for the Secretary of State within a year. The department will continue to promote a stable, prosperous, and free country for the Cuban people, even with reduced staff at Embassy Havana. In fact, that's the main reason we are maintaining our presence there, so we can make continued progress towards those goals. Before turning to Ambassador Bodie, I would like to emphasize up front that the investigation into the health attacks is ongoing. There is still much we do not know, including who or what is behind the injuries to our colleagues. With that, I yield the microphone to my colleagues to discuss this further, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Before I turn it over to Ambassador Bodie, I have to apologize for mispronouncing his name. When I first read this, I thought, well, anyone who's related to Cheyenne Bodie, and anyone here that's young, leave the room because you never heard of that show. But it was one of my favorite shows, and I was obviously intimidated by anybody named Bodie and related to Cheyenne. So with that crazy introduction, Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Cook, Ranking Member Sears, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you on the Department's of State's efforts to coordinate a multi-agency response to the unexplained health attacks that have affected some members of Embassy Havana's diplomatic community. I'd like to speak about 2 challenges outlined in the Department's written statement. First, the challenge of responding to these attacks on our personnel with so many significant unknowns, and the challenge of providing the best long-term care for our impacted personnel. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Sears, my experience over the past 7 months, serving first as the chair of the Cuba Accountability Review Board, and now overseeing daily coordination of the department and interagency activities leading the Health Incidents Response Task Force, has given me an in-depth look into how the department has responded to these attacks on our diplomatic community. As you know, 26 individuals associated with Embassy Havana have incurred medically confirmed, unexplained symptoms and health effects since the department first became aware of these attacks on December 30th, 2016. Reported acute symptoms have included dizziness, headaches, tendinitis, fatigue, visual problems, ear complaints, hearing loss, and difficulty sleeping. Many of the affected personnel later developed other symptoms, including cognitive problems and imbalanced walking. While the department first became aware of these health complaints and an increase in Cuban harassment in late December 2016, it was not until months later, after highly specialized medical testing was performed and analyzed by experts, that we began to understand the spectrum and severity and confirm the extent of the health effects. That confirmation indicated that these incidents went beyond routine harassments previously experienced by our diplomats in Havana. As Secretary Pompeo briefed the broader House Foreign Affairs Committee on May 23rd, the department has also determined that on May 18th, that a single individual in Guangzhou, China, was found to have medical findings that were consistent with those of affected U.S. government personnel in Cuba, although we are unable to say whether the cause is likely the same. Let me be clear, the department does not currently know the mechanism for the cause of the injuries, the source or the motive behind the attacks in Cuba, or when they actually commenced. Yet throughout this unprecedented situation, from the first reported health complaint through the confirmation of the onset of adverse related medical symptoms, U.S. government medical professionals have ensured that competent and professional care has been provided to our impacted personnel. They collaborate closely with the medical centers of excellence, such as the University of Pennsylvania Center for Brain Injury and Repair, the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, and the National Institutes of Health. We have also asked the Centers for Disease Control for their expertise to better understand what transpired in Havana. In order to ensure that our affected personnel have access to long-term workers' compensation coverage, the department also works closely with the Departments of Labor's Office of Workmen's Compensation Programs. When we found potential gaps in the ability to care for those affected under current authorities, we began discussing with other agencies in the White House possible legislative language, which we will share for your consideration once we have an interagency consensus, to make sure our impacted diplomats and their families receive the care they deserve without incurring personal financial burden. We are also establishing a new position solely responsible for the longer-term outreach and assistance to impacted personnel. Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Sears, in conclusion, I want to assure you that we continue our effort to leverage all governmental, medical, investigative, intelligence, and scientific capabilities to address the most pressing questions surrounding these attacks. Your support remains a key element to our success. Congressional interest is crucial as we work diligently to identify and to understand the mechanism for the cause of the injuries, the motive behind these attacks, and the identity of the perpetrators. I'm pleased to take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Masenak, before I recognize you, I want to make sure you don't have any relatives that made Westerns in circa 1950, but after looking at you, I don't think that's obviously relevant, but
No, sir, I do not.
please, if you would testify now. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Cook, Ranking Member Sires, distinguished members of the subcommittee and staff. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss GAO's work on the Department of State's response to the health incidents in Havana, Cuba. As you are aware, and as was just mentioned, since late 2016, U.S. personnel and their families in Havana have experienced incidents associated with unusual sounds or auditory sensations that resulted in serious injuries. The unprecedented and unexplained nature of these incidents created some management challenges for state as it responded and continues to respond. It is important to identify and address these challenges in order to help state improve security programs and practices at all overseas posts. First, I will be discussing our July 2018 report, which was released yesterday, on state's process for convening an Accountability Review Board, or ARB. Second, I will be discussing our preliminary observations on 3 key management challenges related to the unexplained nature of the incidents. On the first topic, we found that state does not have policies to ensure that its office responsible for initiating the process for convening an ARB is made aware of incidents that may meet the ARB criteria. The responsible office, state's Office of Management Policy, Right-Sizing, and Innovation, or MPRI, starts the incident vetting process as soon as it becomes aware of a potentially qualifying incident. However, MPRI relies on informal communication to identify such incidents. With regard to the situation in Havana, other state offices began responding to the incidents in January of 2017. However, MPRI was not made aware of the incidents until 8 months later, in mid-August, when a former MPRI official contacted the office after seeing media coverage of the incidents. Officials from the responding state offices told us it was unclear whether the incidents met the criteria for convening an ARB, and thus they did not inform MPRI. However, it is not the role of state offices to evaluate whether the incidents meet ARB criteria before reporting them to MPRI. If MPRI is not aware of incidents, it cannot initiate state's ARB incident vetting process. This puts state at risk of not meeting statutory timeframes for convening an ARB, and, most importantly, could result in state being less able to improve security at overseas posts. In our report, we recommended that state revise its policies to improve communication to MPRI of incidents that may meet ARB criteria. The second topic I'd like to discuss today is our preliminary observations from our broader ongoing review of states' response to the incidents in Cuba. To date, we've identified 3 key management challenges related to the unexplained nature of the incidents. The first management challenge relates to mitigating risk to U.S. personnel given the unknown nature of the incidents. Because the department does not have definitive answers on the cause or source of the attacks, it has not been able to comprehensively reduce the risk of injury to personnel. Instead, state has taken other actions to mitigate risk, such as ordering the departure of family members and non-emergency personnel in Havana and directing all posts to review and, if necessary, revise their emergency action plans. The second management challenge we identified is caring for affected personnel and family members. State officials have made it clear that caring for affected individuals is their top priority. However, state has faced multiple issues in providing this care. For example, the Bureau of Medical Services, MED, lacked authority for domestic medical evacuations to send individuals to the University of Pennsylvania for evaluations and care. This issue was addressed just last week when state delegated full authority for domestic medevacs to MED. The third and final management challenge I want to highlight is state's communication with internal and external stakeholders. As mentioned earlier, state had issues ensuring MPRI was in the loop as the incidents initially occurred. Externally, state also experienced difficulties in communicating with other departments and agencies in responding to these incidents. As Ambassador Bodie noted, the ARB has completed its work. The ARB identified some of the same challenges I just mentioned, and state has also established the Health Incidents Response Task Force in May to direct the multi-agency response to the incidents. Both of these efforts are resulting in changes that may address some of these management challenges. As GAO continues its broader review, we will be examining the ARB's findings and state's ongoing response. Chairman Cook, Ranking Member Sires, and members of the subcommittee, this concludes my statement. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. In the questions that come out right now, I think you're going to hear, I don't know, at least from me, we're somewhat bewildered, frustrated. This goes back quite a while ago when it first happened. We had some classified hearings at it, and no one could figure out what's going on. Ironically enough, I had a meeting. There were a number of us that were in Ottawa, and we were talking about trade and stuff like that. But I asked the same questions since you had some folks from your embassy that was involved in this. And I'm not saying we didn't get a straight answer, but I'm still bewildered as to the origin of this. And obviously the staff there was cut down quite a bit because of the safety concerns. And I'm always somewhat worried about people that are in precarious positions throughout the world. I think sometimes we kind of forget about how dangerous it is. And my own personal experiences are going back to Iran when that hostage situation when they seized the Ayatollah Khomeini. 400 days, it was really a mess. I can go different countries and what have you. The question I have is, from a medical standpoint, and maybe it's a medical question more than anything else, what kind of positive, do you have any fingerprints on this? Who is responsible? We even heard the allegations the Russians might be involved, this and that. And so at least from my standpoint, we've got a lot of, well, what happened on this? Because I'm worried about the ambassadors, but I'm more worried about the families and everyone else that can be innocent bystanders or something like this. And we will have a policy if we can just figure out what's going on. Anybody want to address that? Rather long question. Doctor? Sure.
So I can speak from the medical perspective. We're frustrated as well. We know the accumulation of medical knowledge tends to be a very deliberate process. I can only speak to what we're trying to do to find out what caused the injuries. You know, as we previously, the symptoms people presented with were vague, very common symptoms. It took some time to figure out that they were connected. When we put the information together, they appeared to be similar to the symptoms and findings you would see in a traumatic brain injury or a head concussion without obvious head trauma. So we had to kind of work backwards and find out what could cause that. We identified the University of Pennsylvania and other locations to see our people, to do thorough evaluations, but still, there's no obvious mechanism we know of that could cause that injury. Yeah. The experts were exploring a number of possibilities. I'm happy to brief in the classified section about.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that. Anything in the literature on this? Obviously, there's papers all the time. I'm not saying it's going to be in the New England Journal of Medicine or what have you, but kind of like football injuries, and don't let your son or your children get involved in this. It's nothing in the medical literature at all that, because it was on the front pages. It was big news there for a while. Right. And no speculation from a medical standpoint.
There's nothing in the old medical literature. Again, this is kind of what we're seeing as a unique syndrome. Probably can't even call it a syndrome. It's a unique constellation of symptoms and findings, but with no obvious cause. There are a lot of speculation in the media. We prefer not to talk about speculation. All I know is the experts who have examined the patients are doing everything they can to determine, you know, where the injuries occurred, what part of the brain, and what possibly could cause it.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to the ranking member for his questions. Oh, we didn't even see.
Chairman, I'm going to let our ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee go. I know he has things to do, so. Elliot.
I'm going to apologize. I didn't see the ranking member hiding out down there, so
Yeah, well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. Participating in these Western Hemisphere Subcommittee hearings always feels like coming home, since I was the chair for a number of years, about a decade ago, and so it's a pleasure to be here. I wanted to raise a few really important questions. Last month, I asked the Congressional Research Service to prepare a report for me on the impact of staff reductions at the U.S. Embassy, Havana. I ask unanimous consent that this report be inserted into the record.
yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Because of the Cuba health incidents, our embassy staff has been drastically reduced from 50 Americans to 18. As a result, we're less able to process Cuban refugees, monitor human rights, and assist U.S. travelers. So no matter where one stands on Cuba policy, I think we can all agree on the importance of a functioning U.S. Embassy in Havana. It's essential to find a balance of protecting our diplomats and asserting our national interests. In December, Chairman Royce and I sent a letter to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention urging them to take a leading role in investigating the health incidents that affected U.S. personnel in Cuba. I think it's a no-brainer that as our nation's top experts on health threats, the CDC should be at the forefront of this investigation with the appropriate experts deployed in Havana. I was pleased that the ARB recommended, and I quote, that the department engaged the CDC to undertake a comprehensive medical and study of the symptoms and clinical findings related to the incidents in Cuba. So I'm pleased that the CDC is finally involved, but I'm concerned and frankly perplexed that it's come so late. On August 16th, my staff met with CDC investigators working on the Cuba health incidents, and they were on day 4 of their work. You heard that right. It's a year and a half after the first incidents took place. The CDC is only now just getting started. So I'd like to ask Dr. Rosenfarb and Ambassador Bowdy, could you explain why it took so long for the CDC to get to work on the Cuba health incidents, and why, on the other hand, did the CDC start their work on the confirmed China incident immediately?
Sir, I'd like to just reinforce that it's taken time to understand the extent of the symptoms and findings and injuries. Right now, in retrospect, we know what injuries happen to folks, but way back when these things first started appearing, December of 2016, and over the course of the next several months, it wasn't evident at that time. And then our first and foremost goal was to provide care to those people who were injured and do assessments. And we accomplished that over the next several months from January 2017 going forward. Once we felt we had people properly cared for, in the fall of 2017, we began talking to CDC. We met with CDC informally a number of times in fall of 2017, and that led to a formal request from the department to CDC in December of 2017 for their active assistance. And we've been very happy with CDC to this point. They've been great partners, and we hope to benefit from their work going forward.
Well, let me ask you, Dr. Rosenfarb, because I certainly appreciate your efforts to treat the victims of the health incidents and to get to the bottom of what happened both in Cuba and in China. So I wanted to ask you about an article that was recently brought to my attention. I understand that the physician who first treated affected U.S. personnel was Michael Hoffer, a former military doctor now at the University of Miami. A Time magazine article from June 2011 about Dr. Hoffer stated, and I quote, "A U.S. military doctor deployed in Iraq subjected troops suffering from traumatic brain injuries to treatment with an unapproved drug in which he had a financial stake that may have harmed them," Pentagon investigators report, unquote. The article goes on to cite an extensive Pentagon Inspector General report on this incident, and CBS News reported, and I quote, that investigators found the study did not use standard military concussion assessments on the soldiers, possibly resulting in substandard care. Had you received, Doctor, have you reviewed these articles or the report of the Inspector General before Dr. Hoffer was brought on to treat U.S. Embassy personnel, and have you received these documents since then?
I'm aware of some of that. When this started to unfold back in early spring 2017, we, members of the U.S. government medical team, reached out initially to Johns Hopkins University to try and figure out who would be the best placed person to see our personnel. If you recall, initially the thoughts were that this was some sort of acoustic attack. The symptoms initially appeared to be localized to the acoustic, the ear system. We reached out to Johns Hopkins. There was a recommendation to go to Dr. Hoffer because of his experience in the military treating brain injury there at the University of Miami. So the first patients back in April and May of 2017 were assessed by Dr. Hoffer. Subsequently, when we determined that it really probably was not localized to the acoustic system, that it was more kind of a broader brain injury process, that's when we made efforts to find a a center of excellence for brain injury and repair, and University of Pennsylvania was then identified, and patients have gone there since.
But doesn't it seem a bit strange that our diplomats suffering from concussion-like symptoms would be sent to a doctor who apparently did not use standard concussion assessments? Isn't that strange?
At the time, we felt he was the best qualified person, the recommendations we received to do the initial evaluation.
Okay, thank you. If anyone else wants to comment? Okay, thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Now recognize the gentleman from Alabama, Congressman Brooks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've heard words like socialist, communist, authoritarian, represses and abuses its citizens' basic freedoms or freedoms that we would take for granted in the United States of America. And upon reflection, that sounds a lot like China. But here we're talking about Cuba. And I would submit there is a major difference, of course, between China and Cuba, and that is that China is a significant geopolitical rival, perhaps a foe. Certainly, China is having a significant military buildup and is threatening in ways that Cuba is not. I'd reference the South China Sea and what is happening there as but one example. So with that all as a backdrop, the question is this: should American foreign policy treat Cuba differently than how we treat China, with whom we have over $400 billion in trade going back and forth? And if we should treat Cuba differently than we treat China, why? If not, why not? Ambassador Martin, could you please take that first, and we'll just work our way across to Ambassador Boddy and then Dr. Mazenak, and if Dr. Rosenfarb or Mr. Brown want to chime in too, that would be fine, but I don't know if this is an area of expertise for you.
Sure. Thanks for the question. I think in our analysis, the case, the situation in China regarding our employees there compared to the situation in Cuba, they are very different. I think we would see them, and Ambassador Boddy can speak to this in greater detail, but I think we see them as sort of apples and oranges. We have 26 cases of people who have very, very similar symptoms, who have very similar effects. It seems to have really been targeted exclusively at our embassy colleagues. Situation in China, to the best of my knowledge, we have one employee who has demonstrated similar symptoms. I don't think our medical experts at this point are prepared to say it is the exact same situation that our colleagues in Cuba have been suggested to. So I think there is a fundamental difference we see at this point anyway in the cases. I'll let my other colleagues talk
Well,
no more.
that perhaps my question wasn't clear. While certainly dozens of Americans suffering some kind of injury that we've not been able to define as to cause has to be something taken into account, I'm thinking of a much bigger question, and the question is America's relationship with China versus relations with Cuba. The nature of the government, the repression of rights, communist, socialist, whatever adjectives you want to use. So should we treat Cuba any different than we treat China? Because it seems that we treat China in a very favorable way relative to how we as Americans treat Cuba.
Again, sir, I'm familiar with the case, our dealings with China only in as far as they touch this case. I've never served in China. I'm not an expert. I'm not an expert on East Asia. My experience in our dealings with China is limited really to this case, mostly, and I don't see, because we see them as very different cases, that you can really make a comparison. I don't disagree with you that China is a competitor, certainly in the region. They're doing some things that we don't find necessarily a positive in the region. But I think, in terms of our discussion with Cuba and this issue that we've been talking about thus far here today, I can't really say any more than I've already said.
Well, does anyone have an opinion on how we should be treating Cuba, given the way in which we treat other geopolitical rivals? It could be China, it could also be Russia, it could be any number of nations. Ambassador Boddy, do you?
Sir, that's really outside my area of expertise. My feeling is that Ambassador Mertens made it clear for this particular incident, we see them as two separate entities. In terms of how we treat Cuba, that's really a question of our overall Cuba policy, which he can...
All right, let me drop the comparison then. Should we treat Cuba more friendly or more harshly?
I defer to my colleague from WHA for that.
I mean, I think we always have to evaluate our relations with countries based on the whole of our relationship. We have a long history over these past many years with Cuba. We have a large expat group from Cuba who lives in this country, many of whom experienced firsthand the depredations of the Cuban regime. They have made their concerns and their interests very clear, not only to us, the State Department, but I'm sure also to many of you here in Congress. Again, I am not an expert on Asia. I can't speak to the details of our
I wasn't
relationship
asking
with
about
China.
Asia anymore.
Yeah.
My question was strictly limited to Cuba.
But I think, we have a policy on Cuba, which was dictated by the National Security Presidential Memorandum. We are enacting that policy. We believe it is appropriate. We believe it is correct. We believe we are doing the best we can to hold the Cuban regime to account for lack of democracy and human rights abuses.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Now recognize Ranking Member, Mr. Sears.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If we are promoting democracy in Cuba, and we're trying to, why are we cutting some of these programs that provide money to the Cuban democracy effort? Ambassador?
Yep. Thanks for the question. First of all, we are, as I noted in my opening comments, we are seeking to promote human rights and democracy in Cuba. We've been asked to do that by the NSPM. I will not pretend that the reduction in our staffing has made that task easier. It has not. Nevertheless, we believe we can remain engaged with human rights activists and pro-democracy activists in Cuba. In terms of funding specifically, as I understand it, there's been a global cut in these types of funding, so we haven't singled out Cuba in particular. But this very much remains a priority for our colleagues at the embassy and for us at the State Department.
I wanted to add that maybe we treat Cuba differently because, I'm sorry when my colleague left, because they were actually putting nuclear weapons 90 miles away from Florida. And they have 30,000 people in Venezuela controlling the apparatus of the security apparatus in Venezuela. Now they have people in Nicaragua that are now starting to control the Nicaraguan people. I just had a group of Nicaraguans in my office telling me that the people that were doing the torturing were the Cubans. And he was able to come to the United States, and now he's going to be a voice for Nicaragua. So there's a long history here of a lot of things that this regime has been wanting to destroy this country in many of his efforts. They've been players in many other places. The other question that I have, you have a list of 180 entities associated with the Cuban military that you have at the State Department that maintains. Are you considering updating that list? Because one of the things that I know that the money that comes from Cuba basically is to tourism. But now the tourism has been taken away and put under the military. So basically tourism money goes to the military. So are you updating the list? And what has the effect been of this restricted list to the Cuban economy engagement?
Sure. Yes, the list is a living document. The list wasn't put together and closed. We review it periodically with our interagency partners based on new information that we get. I agree with you. The goal behind the Cuba restricted list that you're talking about was to do our utmost to ensure that elements of the Cuban state, particularly the Ministry of Defense, the Cuban military, wasn't benefiting or profiting from particularly American tourists that are American people that happen to be visiting Cuba for a variety of reasons. So we hope to be channeling their activities in Cuba to the private sector, to B&Bs, that type of thing, small family, private sector run operations, and therefore depriving the Cuban military of a source of income. I'm not aware that we have done a quantitative analysis of the effect of that thus far. Something we should probably do, but our belief is that it will have an impact on denying funding that would otherwise go to the Cuban state.
Thank you. And this idea that this program that we had with doctors that the Cuban government uses to send to different countries in lieu of payment to Cuba, and some of these doctors have asked asylum in some of these places. That program is gone, isn't it?
I'm not aware, sir. I can't answer that. I'll have to take that back and get you an answer.
Ambassador, do you know if it's gone, that program? Because of what?
Sorry, sir, I'm not aware. We'll have to take that back and get an answer. That's
Anybody is aware of this? Because there used to be doctors that were asked for asylum, and we were granted them.
I don't know that we've granted any asylum cases. I'll have to again check on that.
Lately, you mean?
I don't know that we ever have. I do know that there have been Cuban doctors who have been present in a number of countries. I was ambassador in Haiti. There were a number of Cuban doctors who were present there. I'm not aware that any of them, certainly while I was there, ever asked for asylum. But again, we will look into that and get an answer back to you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Yoho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, I appreciate you all being here. I am from Florida, represent the 3rd Congressional District, and we've gone down to Miami often to meet with the Cuban-American population. And I want to build on that question that my colleague, Mr. Cirrus, brought up about the 180 individuals. That was a question that they brought up. So if you can get us that information of the businesses, individuals or business in Cuba that are blocked from doing business with the U.S., that would be very helpful so that we can put pressure on the appropriate entities and help make that become a fruition. And can you provide an update of where things stand regarding U.S. property claims?
Sure, and we can get you that list, I believe, of Cuban entities that are on the list. If you or any of your colleagues or constituents are aware of other entities you believe that should be listed, please send that on to us.
We will send that on to you.
Investigate and have a look. Regarding property claims, we have this has been one of our chief issues in terms of dealing with the Cuban government. There are a lot of people many of whom are now living in the United States, who have had property expropriated by the Cuban government. We have laws, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, under the Libertad Act to punish folks who are caught trafficking in such properties. And certainly it is a major issue in terms of that we want to see resolved with the Cuban government.
Well, and this goes back to poor foreign policy. We should never have gone down this road without having this stuff worked out in the very beginning from the previous administration to open up, travel and going into there like everything's okay without having these things negotiated was a big, big mistake and a failure in foreign policy. I've got people from Florida and all over the United States, basically, that had businesses down there. They have ports. Cruise ships are going in there, and there are family ports that these families got their property confiscated from. And the Cuban government's making a ton of money off of this illegal property. And for us to open up the borders or open up negotiations and relationships with them without having this worked out in the beginning was a terrible mistake in foreign policy. And this is something now we're trying to reel back. And once you let the toothpaste out of the tube, it's hard to get it back in. And unfortunately, we're here. So how do you move forward from this point? I mean, you look at the situation of the Cuban people today, they're no better off than they were 30 years ago, are they? Anybody want to claim they are? No. And so we're trying to build a democracy, and I'm all for Radio Marti. We've been down to Miami. We've seen the broadcast studio. We've done interviews down there, and it's a great tool to spread the message of liberty and freedom, which everybody in the world really wants and desires. Yet you've got a communist regime in there that's just not allowing that. So we can give pockets of that, and I think we should continue to do that. But boots on the ground, I think maybe we need to look at how we do things down there. Does anybody have any ideas of what would be outside of the box that you're able to talk about?
Sir, I'd be happy, or my colleagues from the Cuba desk would be happy to have some discussions with you. I'm not going to speculate here on possible policy avenues, though I don't think it would be appropriate for me to do that.
Anybody else here? Nope. No takers. Okay. How about vacancies at the State Department? I know it was talked about a little bit. The lack of the confirmed leadership at the State Department impacted by State Department's response to the targeted attacks in Havana. Where are we at with the people that should be put into place and they're being held up or not being confirmed?
Sir, I'm chairman of the ARB. We looked at this very issue, and one of the things we found when we were looking at it was we had virtually everyone involved in responding to this crisis was acting in an acting capacity. And it was the view of the Accountability Review Board that perhaps might have slowed down the response, and that people didn't feel they had the necessary authorities to do the jobs they had to do. That's one of the recommendations the Accountability Review Board made.
And then let me just touch on the doctors in Cuba. President Obama, I thought, did us a great favor by getting rid of the wet foot, dry foot policy. We've got people down in, again, Florida. We saw all the refugees coming over in boats any way they could come over. But when he got rid of the wet foot, dry foot policy, that virtually stopped. And I thought he did that for the betterment of America and keeping the Cubans safe from crossing that strait. But what we found out, he did that to appease the Castro regime, to keep his doctors from coming over here, because the doctors that they farm out to the rest of the world brings in about $18 billion of revenue to the Cuban government. So he did this to better off the Cuban government, not the Cuban people or our foreign policy. And I think it's another shameful thing that that administration did. And with that, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Congresswoman Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ambassador Merton, when President Trump announced his intent to cancel President Obama's deal with Cuba, one of the stated aims of his new approach was to support the Cuban people. The policy curbed travel to and trade with Cuba, and almost immediately the impact was clear. Cancellations at private bed and breakfasts, restaurants that were accustomed to flocks of foreign patrons now empty, large tour groups set to hire a private classic car chauffeur service began receiving cancellations of their contracts. President Trump's rhetoric and restrictive travel regulations resulted in an ambiguity, I would say, that caused U.S. travel to Cuba to drop by as much as 40% in the first part of 2018. Less independent travel means less revenue for Cuba's entrepreneurs who have risked so much for the chance to determine their economic future, many of which cater to those U.S. travelers. One restaurateur quoted by the Washington Post cites a 70% dip in business compared with the year prior. The stated intent of the policy was to help the Cuban people, but they don't feel supported. And we've kind of been asked this before, but what changes do you plan to enact to carry out the policy's stated intent to truly help the Cuban people?
Thank you for the question. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, the NSPM not only reaffirms our embargo on Cuba, but also maintains the statutory ban on tourism. People who go to tourists, which is why I corrected my speech earlier, people who go to Cuba under one of the broad licenses given by the Treasury Department are not really, strictly speaking, supposed to be there as tourists. Our goal is to deny the Cuban regime, particularly the Ministry of Defense, Cuban military, of a stream of revenue that they had before. There may be some collateral effect of this in that fewer people may be going, and fewer people going means less business to some of these private sector entities, which we certainly do want to see helped, and we do want to see them thrive. But in a economic system where the incentives are, for lack of a better term, corrupted, as they are in Cuba, because you have the state which is really involved in virtually every aspect of the economy, it is hard to do both of those things simultaneously. So I understand your concern, but I hope I've explained the policy point on that.
I understand it's hard to do both at the same time, but I guess in a way it seems like, at least for a little while, there was some economic development. People were more than surviving, but thriving, and now we pulled that back. So I wonder how we look in their minds also. You said in your statement that the Cuba Internet Task Force should be receiving a report by late summer, so I assume any day now. What are the Cuban government's plans for expanding Internet access?
You know, we've had some discussions on this. Obviously, from our point of view, I shouldn't say obviously, from our point of view, one of the key tools that the regime has used against the Cuban people is control of information. And one of our goals, through however way we can increase internet penetration in that society, we believe will ultimately be not only to the good of the Cuban people, but to the good of society there writ large, which will expose them to a world that doesn't have controlled information. So we're going to continue to beaver away at this. This is not going to be an area where we're going to see success from today to tomorrow. But I think constant pressure on them from us, from other partners, and frankly demands, I think increasing demands from the Cuban people will be able to see us over time see some success in this area.
You're scheduled to complete your work by June 2019 with this. Is there any danger that another country can step in and take advantage where we haven't been able to step in?
You know, you have about exceeded my knowledge on this particular subject. I'm happy to take that back and get back to you with an answer, but I don't want to mislead you.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson, 2.5 minute question. Then we're going to adjourn.
My goodness. Well, thank you, Chairman Cook. And Secretary Merton, I'm really grateful that I see a bipartisan concern here. Congressman Ceres and Congressman Yoho, and that is the relationship that exists between the Cuban people and their government, and in particular the economic system, where the Cuban military actually controls a phenomenal percentage of the whatever enterprises, I wouldn't even call them businesses. What percentage does the military control?
I don't know that off the top of my head, sir. We can get back to you with that.
Well, it was my understanding it was a very high percentage, and that whatever funding goes to the enterprise actually is to benefit the Cuban military and the oppression of the people of Cuba, not for what would be perceived as possible. Also, in Cuba, when American tourists go there, or tourists from around the world who've always gone there, they've never been barred from visiting the totalitarian state. That when they go, And the people who are at the enterprises, like a resort, a hotel, whatever, of confiscated property from somebody else, what currency are they paid, are the workers? Are they paid in Cuban currency? Are they paid in US dollars? Or do they receive some type of script?
I may be wrong, sir. I think remember back in the 90s, they used to be paid in dollars, but I believe that has changed. They are now paid in some sort of Cuban currency, I believe.
And that it's really not a currency that could be used anywhere except at the company store. And so, again, to keep the people oppressed. And it's really sad to me that anyone who would go there would think that there might be promoting some level of freedom and democracy when they're not. A final question, back about the Dr. Ms. Zanuck, in regard to your written testimony ordering the personnel to be moved from Havana. Is that still your view that that was correct to do
Thank you, sir. So,
in light of the attacks?
so that was one of the preliminary observations we had in terms of the ways the State Department has had to respond because of the unknown nature of the incidents. They've had to mitigate risk, and you're correct. One of the ways they did so was by the order of departure and then the reductions that were made permanent this spring. I think that's something that we'll continue to look into as we complete our ongoing work and evaluate their response.
Well, we appreciate all of your service. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Real quick, I want Mr. Espiat, he's been very, very patient here. I'll give you a minute and a half, and then we're going to adjourn to the SCIF for the classified setting, and you can have 10 minutes or longer.
A GAO report and an Accountability Review Board report also referred to the events in Cuba as incidents. Ambassador Merton, was this an incident or an attack? One of the two.
I think the State Department has come to the belief that, Secretary Tillerson came to the belief that what happened in Cuba is an attack because all the information we have seen is that it seems to be targeted specifically at our embassy and one other embassy that we know of, Canada's employees, diplomats.
Ambassador Bodie, incident or attack?
Sorry. State Department's come to the position that they were attacked, sir.
Dr. Rosenbar, an incident or an attack?
I agree with Ambassador Bodie.
Mr. Brown?
I'd put it in the category of attack based on we have 26 injured Americans. Those attacks do not seem to extend outside the diplomatic community.
Dr. Masanek, an incident or an attack?
So we deferred and used the language that the State Department did in our report, but I think this issue emphasizes the importance of the department addressing some of the communication challenges we identified so they can make these determinations as promptly as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Real quick, pursuant to Committee Rule 7, the members of the subcommittee will be permitted to submit written statements to be included without objection. The hearing record will be open for 5 business days to allow statements and other things. We're going to adjourn down to the SCIF, and it'll be upon conclusion of votes. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.